Yes.
So we're in this series titled Finish Strong. And the reason I showed you that because as we, on our last week of this series of Finish Strong, today I want to talk about is not how you start, but rather how you finish.
Come on.
It's not how you start, but rather how you finish. It's a time to play,
Yes.
and it's a time to win.
All right now.
I showed you that clip simply because of these three reasons. You had one guy. You guys, some of you guys remember that game. I remember that game. Reggie Miller, they're down 8-9 points, and Reggie Miller scores 8 points in 9 seconds.
Wow.
Probably the shortest, some of the shortest amount of time that we've seen and had the most points scored. He scored 8 points in 9 seconds. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. All right? So, he was consistent. But here's the challenge. It was other guys who had pretty good games starting out in that game. Jerry Starks, the guy he talked about that choked, had 21 points, 7 assists, 3 rebounds that game. That's a pretty good game.
Yeah.
Started out strong, but in the end, you see what Reggie Miller said about it. He choked. Got up in the line on the free throw line in crunch time and missed 2 game-winning free throws. He choked in the end. He didn't finish strong. You had a Reggie Miller who was consistent all throughout the game. He was consistent. He was consistent all throughout the game. And he finished strong. And today I want, again, to talk to you about is not how you start, but rather how you finish. A lot of people start out real strong. They start out with a lot of zeal. And life happens. You guys heard me say it before. Mike Tyson says this. He said, everybody that got in the ring with him, they had a plan until he punched him in the face. So everybody that got in the ring with him, they, for just a quick second, they had a plan. He said, till I punched him in the face. And that's what life does to us. We start out with zeal. We start out on fire. We start out just gung-ho about a vision or something that God gave us, and life happens. And it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond on what happens to you.
Amen. Yes, God.
Some of us, even in this year, have started out real strong, and life happened. And the challenge is, some of us are wishing right now that 2020 was over. But how many of you know God can do something absolutely amazing in the twinkling of an eye, in the snap of a finger? God can do something amazing. Some of us have already had 1 foot in 2021 already. And here's the challenge with that. If you do not get the rest of what God has for you in 2020, you know when you're going to get it? In 2021. The key to tomorrow lies in today. So you gotta embrace today. You can't skip today, because reality is that if you try and skip today, you will have to face what God has for you in today. So we gotta embrace today. We often hear the scripture, Romans 8:28 says, all things work together for the good for those that love the Lord. The Bible declares that it didn't declare that all things would be good. It said that God would work them out for your good. For your good. Never said they would be good, but they would work out for your good. So again, let's get right to it. It's not how you start, but rather how you finish. Today I want to talk to you about a famous story. You guys all know it. It's titled The Prodigal Son. That's found in Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 31. So let me walk you up to this real quickly. So in this, Luke begins to talk about from chapter 15, verses 1 through verse 7. He begins to talk about the parable of the lost sheep. He begins to talk about that if a man had 100 sheep and one wandered off, he would leave the 99 and he would go find the one. In verses 8 through 10, he talks about a woman who had 10 silver coins and she lost one, it said that she would look for it, and when she found it, she would call all her friends over, and they would rejoice, have a party, and they would be happy. So he's talking about something is lost when it is found, that all would rejoice. And then he gets to verse 11. He begins to talk about the parable of the lost son, or we know it as the prodigal son. That word prodigal simply meant he was living wastefully and recklessly extravagant. He was living wastefully or recklessly extravagant. You guys know the story. Just to paraphrase it real quick, you know the story. We got three characters in that story. You got the younger son, you have an older son, and you have the father, who are the main three characters in those story. And they all possess three different principles that I want to share with you today. Are three different positions. I need you to write this down. One cheated the process. So one cheated the process. He started wrong, but he finished right. I'm going to go back and fill that in for you. So he cheated the process. He started wrong, but he finished right. That was the younger son. Second thing is this. One got lost in the process. So he started wrong and he finished wrong. So he started wrong and he finished wrong. And the third character, he embraced the process. He started constant and he stayed consistent. So one cheated the process. Another one got lost in the process. And then you had a third one who embraced the process. And right there, some of you guys feel, y'all fit in one of those categories. I know you did. All of us fit in one of those categories. So starting at verse 11. Starting at verse 11. Says this. To illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. He says, a man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of the estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. Now the first thing we got to notice right here is that's not normal, because in those days you didn't get your inheritance until the father died. Does that sound kind of familiar? We didn't get our full inheritance until Jesus had to die for us to get our full inheritance, right? Yeah. So in those times where you didn't get your inheritance until the father died, and it says that he divided the wealth between his son. That's not normal either, because in those days as well, the older son always got a double portion of the blessing. He always got a double portion of the inheritance, but the Bible declares that he divided it evenly amongst his sons. So you had two things that were out of the normal in that case. He gave them the inheritance before they were ready for it. Does that sound familiar? If God gives you a blessing before you are ready for it, you will mess it up. Some of us want it when we want it. And so as we see this illustration here, as we get down to it, the younger son got his inheritance before time. And if God a lot of times gives us a blessing or gives us what we want when we ask for it, we would mess it up. Now the challenge is when God makes us a promise and the times it takes for him to fulfill it. That's called that betwixt place. You know, that between a rock and a hard place. And a lot of times we want that blessing, but reality is we are not ready for it. So that gap between when God makes us a promise and the time it takes for him to fulfill it, that's where it's tough for us. Because reality is when God makes us a promise, where we are doesn't look like the promise.
Right.
Matter of fact, most of the time when God makes us a promise, most of the time we're in this chaotic place. We're in this place where things are not going so good, and God will step right in and make us a promise. I use the example all the time in Jeremiah 29:11, where God says, hey, I know the plans that I have for you. But in that situation, the children of Israel was in a bad situation. It was actually Babylonian captivity for 70 years. God tells them right in the middle of their worst times of their life, build houses, have children, plant gardens, and do all of these things. Right in the middle of the most chaotic times of their life, God steps in and tells them to start doing all these good things.
Yeah.
And they look up and say, what? And God says, hold on. I know the plans that I have for you. My plans are to prosper you and not to harm you. Some of us are in a season right now where things are not going so good. Some of us are in a season right now where it looks like the promises that God made us, the situation doesn't look like the promise. But God told you to do those things right in the middle of where you are, because that's a test. God is testing your faith. And so a lot of times we base our faith off the situation rather than the word of God. If you base your decisions based off the situation, you will miss out on the promise every time, because most of the time, the situation does not look like the promise that God made you. Can I get a witness in here today? That God has made you a promise, and right where you are, it doesn't look like the promise that God has said.
Come on.
Yeah.
That's good.
It doesn't look like it. But then God comes right back and gives you a comforting word, the most comforting word in all the Bible. We use it all the time. I just told you. For I know the plans I have for you.
Yes.
My plans are to comfort you and prosper you right in the middle of your chaos. Somebody better get that. God says my plans are to prosper you right in the middle of the chaos. My plans are to prosper you right in the middle of the night. My plans are to prosper you when your bank account says zero. My plans are to give you peace right in the most chaotic times of your life. My plan is to prosper you.
Thank you, Lord.
Right in the middle of it. Right in the middle of it. So, two things again. This younger son wanted the promise or the inheritance before time. And number two, it was out of the norm to divide it equally, because the older son always got a double portion. So, verse 13. It says, a few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money in wild living. He was wilding out. It says about the time his money ran out, right at the time his money ran out, imagine that. It says a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. The younger man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him. I'm going to pause right there for a minute.
Wow.
If you cheat the process, sometimes right in the middle of that process, if I said he started wrong, but he finished right. But in the middle of him cheating the process, and if you cheat the process, you will always have to settle for something less than God has for you. He was in his promised land. He was living with his father, who had an abundance. But because he cheated the process and tried to speed up the process of God, he had to settle for a man-made blessing. He had to settle for whatever was given to him because he tried to cheat the process. Anytime we try and cheat the process of God, we go away from the blessings of God. But when we begin to walk in the things of God and do it God's way, we'll be in the grace flow of God. See, God is not obligated to do anything for us when we go our own way. But when we walk in the will of God and the directions of God, God is obligated to perform and to do what he said he will do. But if you go outside the will of God, God is not obligated to do anything for you. Now, God will do it just because of who he is, not because of who you are. But again, once the younger son went outside the will of God and tried and cheat the process, then he got man-sized results instead of God-sized results. So if you want God-sized results, then you can't cheat the process. So it says, he says, but no one gave him anything. You see that? It says no one gave him anything. Verse 17. It says, but watch this. It says, he finally came to his senses. He stopped being a fool. Well, he finally came. Somebody say he finally came to his senses. And so what happened? It says he finally came to his senses. So that meant that he bumped his head more than one time. He ran into some issues more than one time. He had some problems more than one time. It says he finally came to his senses and he said to himself, this fella had a conversation with himself. He said that at home, he said, even the hired servants have food enough to spare. And here I am, dying of hunger. Verse 18. Okay. He says, I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you. Last verse. It says, and I am no longer worthy of being called your sons. Please take me on as a hired servant. So again, when you try and cheat the process, then you are at the mercy of that process. But when you walk in the will of God and the favor of God, then you will receive the blessings and the favor of God. Now, here's what we need to get at this point. Now, we know the story goes on to say that the father took him back. And so a point that I want to make to you is this, is we can't settle in the process. Don't settle in this process. If God has made a promise to you in this season, if you have not received that promise, that simply means that God is not finished yet. So what am I saying? I'm saying don't settle in this process. If God has not manifested the promise that he has made to you, that simply means that God is not finished yet. In this season of 2020, some of us again have already stepped into 2021, and we have settled for what 2020 has given us. And I decree, we've been seeing this, that we are thriving in this season, not just surviving. So you got to understand, if God has not manifested the promise yet in this year, that simply means that God is not finished yet. So you cannot settle for everything that has happened in 2020, because God is not finished yet. Number two, you can't give up in this process. You can't give up in this process. You seen the younger son, he started out wrong, but when it says when he stopped being a fool, when he came to himself, he didn't just say, I'm going to stay in this wilderness place and die. He didn't say, hey, I'm starving and I'm going to die. The Bible declares that he came to himself. He did not give up. He says, hey, you know what? I was eating good at my father's house. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to die this man. I'm going to go back to my father's house. Many of us strayed away from the will of God. And we just think we went too far astray that God will not take us back. Well, I'm here to tell you today, don't settle in this process. Don't give up in that process, because God will always take back a repentant heart, a transformed heart, a changed mind. He will always take it back. The Bible declares that he's married to the backslider. There's nowhere that you can't go far enough outside of God's presence that if you do not change your heart, that God will not take you back. That's for somebody in the day. Some of us think that we strayed too far out and think that, hey, I've done this and I've done this, and that's guilt. That's condemnation.
All right.
That's why Romans 8, it declares that therefore there is no condemnation to those that are in Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Father.
My pastor always said, when you see the word therefore, you got to ask yourself, what is it there for? So why does he say therefore there is no condemnation? Because condemnation is of the enemy. There's guilt. And the Bible declares that when God frees you, he frees you from the guilt and the sin. That's why some Christians they can receive freedom, receive salvation, but still live in bondage.
You're right. You're right.
Can receive salvation, but you still walking in bondage. Why? Because you free, you saved from the penalty of hell and also from the power of sin, but we still are walking in guilt. Guilt tells you, hey, you're not worthy. Guilt tells you, I don't deserve this. Guilt tells you, I've done too much. Guilt tells you that God won't take me back. Guilt tells you that I don't deserve this. But the Bible declares that the Holy Spirit convicts you.
Yes.
Simply mean that he puts you in a place where you recognize you're wrong.
Yes.
And so when you recognize those wrongs, that you have a repentant heart.
That's right.
That you turn from that behavior. And you also change your mindset of how you thought about that behavior. So he started out wrong, but he finished right. How did he finish right? The Bible declares that he went back to his father and said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and also you. So he repented of what he did, and he also changed his mind about that behavior of being prodigal. And it says that when he came to himself, he went back to the Father.
Yes.
And the Bible declares that the Father took him back.
Yes.
So you can't cheat the process. The younger son cheated the process. Now I'm going to skip around right here for a minute because I want to save the last one for the best one for last. So number 2, you had the older son. He got lost in the process. Can I pull up verse 25? So the older son got lost in the process. Now let me explain this a little bit. Now we've heard this story over and over and over and over. And reality is the younger son gets the bad rap on this, right? Because he was prodigal. He took the inheritance. He ran off, lived a riotous life, and he gets the bad rap for it. But reality is, the main character in this story is actually the older son. The main character in this story is actually the older son. Let me give you some Bible for that, because I messed some of y'all up right there. Verse 25, it says, Meanwhile, the older son was in the field working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house. And he asked one of the servants, what was going on? Verse 27, it says, Your brother is back. He was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. Somebody say self-righteous. He was self-righteous. Self-righteous. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. His father came out and begged him. Verse 29. But he replied, All these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing, you told me to do. And in all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friend. Verse 30. Yet when this son of yours, he disowns his brother. He says, this is your son.
Yeah.
This is your son. This is your son. Have you guys ever been in a situation where, you was rolling with some people and you maybe made a mistake and they just rolled you off, discounted you, you've been doing them jokers all your life, and you're like, hold on, I made one little mistake and you gonna just roll me off like that? So he says, yet when this son of yours come back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf? His father said to him, look, this son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. So let me explain to you why this guy is the main character of the story, really. So you got one son that started wrong, but he ended up right. He cheated the process. The older son, he got lost in the process. He started wrong and he finished wrong. See, the older son, he was with the father the whole time, but didn't realize he had access to everything that the father had because he was there with the father.
Come on.
How many of us are like we saved, sanctified, and all this stuff, but we living beneath what God has for us?
All right.
When you got access to everything God has, but we just hadn't tapped into it. As we see in this, the older son was self-righteous. Watch this. He was trying to earn it based off his works. Watch this. He says, I've done everything you told me to do. Not once have I refused to do any of it. So he was basing a relationship off works. Our relationship with God is not, our dwelling with God is not based off works, but it's based off relationship.
Yeah.
So once you realize that you are in relationship with God, if I'm in relationship with my wife, so that means I have access. Okay, we got kids here.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, kids. But I got access to my wife.
Right.
Yeah, I got access to her. But when you don't realize that, but if I did just things just based off works and not realizing that we was in relationship, then I miss out on something because on those days that like I'm gonna miss it sometimes. So a lot of times we base things on performance. If I don't perform good that day, I don't feel worthy that day. If I don't measure up that day, if I don't do everything right that day, I don't feel worthy of it. And so, but once you are in relationship, you know that you have access to all those things.
Come on.
And so the older son said, I've done all these things, and you haven't given me anything, not realizing that he had access to everything. So here's a point I want to give you real quick. You got to realize that you got to stay in your lane. See, the older son was saying, hey, I'm watching the younger son, and he did all these things, and yet you take him back. Not realizing that he was probably in the best position, but he was trying to stay in the younger son lane and not realize that God had given him access to everything. It's possible, again, I said this already, that you can receive salvation, but not walk in salvation. It's possible that you can receive the blessings of God because once you receive Jesus, that's an all-inclusive plan, that everything comes with it, but you don't walk in those blessings, and you begin asking God for things that you already have access to. I'm talking about the older son. He was asking the Father for something that he already have access to. Saints of God, I'm telling you, you got access to everything that God owns.
That's good.
You got access to everything that God owns. Only thing you got to do is, he says that you have not because you ask not.
Ask not, yeah.
Let me show you this real quick. Luke 24. Watch this. Luke 24. Luke 24. Take me to Luke 24 real quick. I didn't give you Luke 24. Luke 24. I didn't give you that. Okay, that's cool. Okay, yeah, here we go. So, now this is after Jesus was crucified, and he's buried in the tomb, and all that. And it says that Mary and Martha and all those guys, they went to the tomb. They ran back and they told the disciples. But it says that the same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. They was talking about the crucifixion and all this that happened, all this stuff. And it says, as they talked and discussed these things, now watch this, these were disciples of Jesus. They had been walking with Jesus. They had access to Jesus. They seen the miracles that Jesus did. They seen all these things. And it says, as they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. Watch this, watch this. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? They stopped short. They stopped short. Sadness written across their faces. Then one of them, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that has happened there the last few days. What things? Jesus asked. The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said. He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We hope he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago. So, my point was this. They were walking with Jesus and didn't recognize Jesus. They were walking with the blessings. They were walking with abundance. They was walking with overflow. They was walking with the one that Ephesians 3:20 talks about, that is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above anything that we can ask, think, or imagine, but didn't recognize it. Sometimes we can be walking right in our promises. We can be living right in the promised land and not realize it, because watch this. It said that they were so focused on the gossip, the talk. They said, are you the only one in Jerusalem who has not heard of what happened? So sometimes we get caught up in the drama that's going on around us, and we can't even recognize what's in front of us. I'm talking to somebody right now. Sometimes we get so caught up in what the people are saying that we don't recognize, like Phoebe said earlier, when God is talking to us. Said Jesus was talking to them, and they didn't even recognize it was him, because they was caught up in everything else that was being said. Last one I got for you is this. Number 3. You got one who embraced the process. So you got one who got lost in the process. You got one who tried to cheat the process. And this last person, it says that he embraced the process. He started constant and he stayed consistent. In verse 20, real quick, verse 20. And this is the father right here. So we talked about the younger son who tried to cheat the process. We talked about the older son who got lost in the process, that he had the blessings and was in the blessings, was living in the blessing, and they didn't even realize it. And then you had the father. It says, so he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with love and compassion. He ran to his son. Get that? It says that he ran to his son. The Bible declares in Hebrews, it says that God rewards those that diligently seek him. The Bible declares that if I be lifted up, he says, I will draw all men unto me. So as we seek and walk in the ways of God, God will meet us right where we are.
That's good.
If you have strayed away from God, if you walk towards God, you transform your heart and try and get back to God, God will meet you right where you are. I said it earlier, you can't go far enough out the way that God will not take a repentant heart back.
Yeah.
It says he was filled with love and compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. Verse 21. It said, his son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both you and heaven, both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Watch this. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast.
Come on.
Yeah.
Last verse. It says, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. It says, so the party begins.
Come on.
So understand this. Understand this. Jesus says this. He says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So when a father's love is so great for you, there's nowhere you can go where, again, a repentant heart God will not take back. So you got to understand that Jesus said, I will never leave you nor will I forsake you. So even though the son had gone his way, God was still with him. The Father's Spirit still with him. And it says that when he seen him, he met him. Number 2, you got to get this. The Father, he expected something good to happen. You got to understand that in those days, it says that he told the servants to go get the lamb or the goat that they had been fattening. Back in those days, it was always, you always kept you had your calves, but you had your good calves. You had the calves that was out here, but you always had one that you always had ready and prepared, because you knew that one day something good was going to happen. Somebody, a royalty was going to come back, and you was going to need the best calf. You was going to need the fattened calf, because it was going to be a feast. So what am I saying? You got to be always in a heart of expectation that something good is going to happen to you. You got to be like every day you got to wake up prepared for the good things to happen. You can't just be in a phase where you just always looking for something bad to happen. The Father, he had an expectancy that his son was going to return one day. And you got to have a heart of expectancy that thing you have been praying for, that thing that you have been hoping for, that thing that you had just been fasting and praying and having faith for, that one day it's going to show up.
Come on.
One day that thing going to show up. You may not know what day it is, but you ready for it when it shows up. And you got an expectancy that it is going to show up.
Come on.
And you got to understand is that the resources are waiting on us. Abundance is waiting on us. See, when the young man decided he was going to return back to the will of God, that resources was waiting on him. That the abundance was waiting on him. That's why you have to finish strong, because resources and abundance and the goodness and the favor of God are waiting on you.
That's good.
So you got to understand.
Thank you, Lord.
You cannot give up in this season.
Mm-mm.
You can't settle in this season.
That's right.
You can't cheat the process. You can't get lost in the process.
Yes, God.
But you got to embrace this process.
Yes.
You got to start constant and stay consistent.
Yes.
We seen the clip earlier. It would have been so easy for Reggie Miller to give up. I mean, like, it was like 30 seconds left in this game. This dude hit 8 points in 9 seconds.
Right.
It would have been so easy just to give up and quit and say, man, this game is over.
Right.
And just quit right in the middle of the process. We 11 months into this year, and some of us have already given up on this year just because of what has happened. God says, I'm still God in spite of what happened.
Come on.
God says, I'm still God because of what happened. God says, my plans are to prosper you right where you are. Right in the middle of this pandemic. Right in the middle of all the chaos. Right in the middle of everything that's going on. God says, my plans are to prosper you and not to harm you. So build houses. Plant gardens. Multiply.
Yeah.
Because he said, if the land prospers, you prosper.
Come on.
That's right.
So my word to you is this. Don't give up just because you may be in a wilderness place. Because God's plans have not changed for you. Amen?
Amen.
Amen. Amen.